Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Mannering. I am an employment lawyer and HR consultant at Langtree Legal. I'm also a AHRI Queensland State Councillor and a co-convenor of the AHRI Cairns network.
I'm Mike Weston. I'm based in London. I'm the author of a book which comes out later on this year called Reimagine, which is all about how you create the perfect business for the future. In my professional career, I'm the founder of a business called Escape Velocity, where I provide mentorship and consultancy around questions particularly pertaining to future of work. I also am the UK lead for the commercial strategy and insight and data transformation team for a management consultancy business called Valtech. I think it's very tempting to go for a really binary answer on this one. And if you wanted to pin me down to a binary answer, my answer would be no, I'm not in favor of it. My starting point is that I feel that employee surveillance and the technologies that sit behind it tend to tread a really difficult line when it comes to the question of privacy. So there's a legal and somewhat ethical point that sits behind that, which we can go into in more detail. But I also think that it tends to reflect a certain cultural tone in an organization. I'd ask the question of why you want to be able to track what your employees are doing. Simply a question of, what we're seeing in some cases where employers are using it to make sure that people are doing what they should be doing when they should be doing it. Then I feel that that's answering the wrong, or in fact, asking the wrong question. I think the better question should be, are they producing the work that needs to be produced in order to make their employment and their contribution to the organization and to the organization's customers successfully? And I don't believe philosophically or ethically that close employee supervision like that is the right way to achieve that.
It's interesting that you say that, Mike, because I think some of the reasons that you said you don't agree with it are probably the reasons that I do. And I think my perspective's changed over time, and probably more so in light of COVID. I think we're looking at, either coming from straight working from home arrangements to a hybrid workplace where, employers need to have that certainty that people are doing the work. And tracking to some extent, I think, helps people to measure productivity. It puts criteria in place to determine whether working from home arrangements are actually something that the business can continue in order to meet its business needs. So I think probably our perspectives overlap slightly, but for different reasons. I think where I draw the line, and I'm probably on board with saying it goes a step too far, is certainly where it's being used for the wrong purpose. So if there's not a common ground between employers and employees as to why employees are being tracked and that all levels of the organisation are being tracked, then I think it can potentially tread into territory that takes it too far.
It comes down to what it is you're trying to measure and why you're trying to measure it. Look, there is certainly no question in my mind that organisations need to be able to make sure that their teams are performing to the best possible capability. I have no argument against that whatsoever. I'm fully on board with that. The question then becomes one of how far do you go? And I think the bigger question is, why are you doing it? What is the purpose of the oversight? Now, I think it was PwC who were working with a financial organization in London and putting together a piece of tracking software that took every single keystroke that was going on people's computers and reporting that back through. And that was developed very deliberately and very, I think, legitimately, because the reason that was being done was because the employees were dealing with high levels of financial transactions, and it was necessary from a compliance point of view to be able to make sure what people were doing, that they were behaving in a certain way. So you have these sorts of these areas of carve-outs where it's completely legitimate to do the tracking, and in those circumstances, it's completely reasonable to put constraints in place that say, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're going to do it. Fine. If, however, it's to make sure, as I've seen some cases of, that people are not taking too long on their toilet breaks, or that that they're sitting at their desk at 8:59 instead of 9:01 in order to do their work, that's where I begin to have a bit of a problem, because I'm personally of the view that one of the things that we've learned over the last 2 years of the pandemic and the great experiment that sits behind our response to the pandemic, which is really shifting the future of work around this, is that we have the opportunity to really decide what's important here. And is what's important the number of hours that somebody is doing and the point in time when they're doing it? Or is it the value of the work that they're producing? And so that then begins to become a more complicated discussion. And I think that if you are taking people who are doing work which is based on providing some kind of value to the client, it should matter a lot less precisely when they do it and where they do it.
That's an interesting point, Mike. And I guess, again, perhaps we are similar but differ on some aspects of that. Not to the minute amount of saying whether someone's, sitting at their desk at, 8:59 or 9:01. But I think particularly what we're seeing with the hybrid workplaces moving into the future is when people are actually performing that work. So yes, it depends on, the value and the productivity of what workers are putting out. But at the same time, how do employers monitor employee well-being to make sure that people aren't, working all around the clock, and making sure they're managing their work health and safety risk, and potentially reaching out and offering support to see if employees are coping. So while it is monitoring them and perhaps feels invasive, on one hand, there's also that opportunity for employers to really use it to make employees feel supported, and understand that someone is checking in on them and knows that they are putting in the hours that they say they're doing when they're in an environment that, is open to many distractions. We've all been there, where it's easier to go and put the washing on when you're working from home than it is to be doing what you need to be doing. So I think there's that great opportunity to be able to offer support and make sure employees are actually doing the work that they say they're doing, but also doing it within a reasonable time that looks out for them as well. Might go out on a controversial limb here with that one, but I think that no matter how great an employee's working environment is, or the culture that an employer may think they have, there will be employees who feel that they can't speak up, or that they're not doing enough, or that going to the boss and saying, I'm not coping, is a sign that they're not doing their job properly. So I think to that end, the employee tracking has the ability to be an unbiased metric that an employer can then use to sit down with an employee and say, hey, can we have a discussion about what's going on here? You would hope that most employees would feel comfortable to speak up and raise concerns. And certainly if you've got a psychologically safe workplace, there's probably more chance of that happening. But I think it just provides employers with that opportunity to have the data, have the metrics, to be able to start conversations and potentially change someone's working life.
I think the reality is that certainly I have seen that go on. I had last year I was working with a mentee in Japan who was told that she had to close her computer down on the 30th of January because she'd done 120 hours of overtime that month already, and she was not allowed to continue. I'm not sure from the employer's point of view whether that was a liability removal decision or a genuine care for her well-being, because 120 hours of overtime on top of an already pretty full week is a lot in a month, right? So the level at which that's set is slightly questionable. So yeah, I get the point about how that needs to be done, but the reality is that I think for the majority of the time, the type of surveillance, the type of tracking that you're talking about, doesn't tend to get used or just get used for that beneficent approach. It tends to get used to beat people up as a stick. Time and time again, I've seen evidence that when people know that they're being watched, it adds a level of stress to what they're doing, and it adds a level of uncertainty, and they do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, and they don't do things that they otherwise would. And I don't think that's good from a psychological safety point of view. I would go so far as to say that putting the kind of tracking that we're talking about in place is something which is almost guaranteed to destroy a sense of psychological safety within an organization.
Something as simple as having software that allows GPS tracking of your employees. If we look at, say, trade industries, businesses that can track where their employees are going, provide an additional customer service to say, hey, your technician's on the way, or, when you're waiting for your roadside assistance, that your vehicle's on its way. those employers obviously have a customer focus as to why the tracking of employees is necessary. And even from an asset management perspective or an invoicing perspective, being able to turn to a customer and say, you know, our person was at your site from this time to this time, it's, you know, there's a record there. I think there's a lot of value, particularly for smaller businesses, in that level of tracking. When we go to the higher level, you know, the PwC example that you spoke of before, Mike, you know, there's an entirely different portfolio of work that those employees are doing, which dictates an entirely different level of surveillance.
There are clear circumstances where this makes sense. And actually, you know, I think one of the things that you mentioned a little earlier on, Lisa, is the question about safety as well. Because if you're tracking where people are and they're out in the field, that means if something goes wrong, you're better able to respond to it early and solve problems before they get out of hand. Completely buy into that. Completely. I have no argument with that. But we need to, even there, to be really careful about how that information gets used, who gets access to it, how it's stored, and whether it's used for the purpose that's intended or whether it's not. So as I said at the start, you know, it's not it can come across as being a really binary argument, this one, because I think there are definitely cases where it makes sense. But I think the number of circumstances in 21st century work where the important criteria is time spent are relatively few. And I think in those circumstances, therefore, we should not be trying to measure that and using it as a way to determine how effective people are. There's a case that's going around, a discussion going around on LinkedIn, started by Robert Glazer this week, where he was talking about a call to, I think it was an American Express call center, and the call got cut off and the person never rang back. And the question is, well, why didn't the operative at Amex call me back? And the answer is because there are metrics on getting through a set number of calls in a set period of time, and the focus is on that optimizing for efficiency piece rather than optimizing for customer delight, customer satisfaction. And it's very easy to go too far in one direction or the other. The reality is you would have had a much happier Amex customer. You'd have had actually probably a much happier operative in the Amex call center if that person had been able to follow through and complete that. But because of the way they're being tracked against time, they don't take what would be the right decision. They take what becomes the efficient solution. And we see that in every level of the types of major customer service centers that we see. And those are often the types of businesses where we're told that actually this kind of maintenance, this kind of tracking is where it's most important.
I just wanted to touch back on a point you made earlier, Mike, around, and I guess this is probably my employee stance on the topic rather than my employer hat. But I think there's a lot of change that employers need to make, particularly, when you look at the industrial underpinnings of the system in which we operate, maximum hours, 38 hours a week, a day is, 7.6 hours. Everything is so measured that I think employers have a long way to go in recognizing how that equates and how that system works with the value output that employees can actually do in perhaps, a different number of hours, whether that's working longer one week and shorter the next, or how that move is made for a whole system that probably needs to change to adapt to the new world of work. Health is probably one of those areas where, I think it just goes a step too far. I certainly think there's scope, you hear about team challenges and people all, having competitions about steps and health and safety type, programs. And if everyone's on board and there's consent, then 100%, I think that's fine for everyone to be sharing and accessing that data so long as everyone agrees. But in terms of employers having access to that data, it definitely needs to come by consent and have a much broader conversation and agreement, than just say your standard GPS tracking. Someone's personal health data is such, a personal amount of information. And as we spoke about before, what is the dominant purpose of collecting that? What business needs that level of information for what purpose? I can't really think of any examples where that's going to be so critical to have that information. We've seen enough of a discussion around vaccine certificates and obtaining COVID information. And you know, the different sides of the arguments that come up around the collection of just that level of information, let alone, you know, sort of the greater tracking around, you know, how an employee might be sleeping or how many steps they're taking a day or how long they're sitting down for. I think, yeah, for me, the health goes a step too far.
So I'm going to make a confession here. If I go back 10 years ago, no, less than 10 years ago, what was it, about 2016, I think it was, in the business I was running at the time, which was a data science consultancy, we decided to do an experiment using Fitbits. And we, for 10 days, for a fixed period, we took about 50% of our team and gave them Fitbits where we could track heart rate and activity. We tracked location through their mobile phone. We asked them a series of questions 3 times a day about what they were doing and what was happening, and we tracked their behavior. And we were doing it as an experiment. We wanted to see what would happen with the data and what we could use it for, whether it was viable. And it was completely optional. You know, people opted in to take part in the study. And as I say, about 50% of people said, yeah, they'll do it. I was quite reluctant to do it, but I felt I couldn't ask people to go somewhere I wasn't prepared to go myself. So I took part. And I saw a lot of the things that you describe. I saw that step competition piece came in really, really clearly. We saw stress levels going up at certain times of day. We saw, you know, there were some really interesting patterns that came out of it. But the thing that's really stuck with me is that one of my team, who's a Buddhist and who's always just, you know, come across to me as being this incredibly calm person who's very, very grounded in everything. She came to me about halfway through the 10 days and she said, I just can't wait for this thing to stop. So, well, why? What's going on? She said, well, I feel completely intruded upon. So you can stop at any time. You know, I absolutely don't want that to be the case. And so she did. She took the thing off. She put it away. She never looked at the Fitbit again, and she removed herself from the trial. And she said, just that sense of everything I'm doing being monitored, I'm finding is really interfering with my own mental health. And it's, you know, that's been one of the formative conversations that's led to me taking the view that I've taken around this. But we published the results of the survey. The other people involved were all happy to continue. We discussed it quite openly. And then we started working with one of the big healthcare providers, health insurance providers here in the UK, who were, what they were keen to do was to set up a voluntary scheme again for people to use these kinds of IoT devices to monitor their health on the basis of that, you know, what I call the Fitbit effect. If you measure it, it will change. So if you get people to measure their steps, they will do more activity. If you get people to say, we're going to give you such and such a benefit if you go to the gym, and you know, all of those sorts of things were built in. And what they were finding was that people were sticking with the program quite closely for up to about 90 days, and then taking the devices off and putting them in a drawer and never wanting to use them again. And so the question we were asked was, looking at the data, can you see any way of gamifying it to give people incentives to carry on using it? And the way it was lined up was this, and this was the argument in favor of it. The argument in favor was that from the employee's point of view, the idea was that it should give them the impression that the employer cared about them enough to give them something that was going to help them to improve their health. From the employer's point of view, it was a way of ensuring that you had a more active, fitter workforce, and there was some good science around the idea that leads to better performance, better output from them. From the insurance company's point of view, it managed down risk, right? It meant that they had to pay out less, in really. So it looked like a perfect win-win-win. But then it keeps coming back to that question about, are you therefore putting people under stress, under mental health stress, to do things that they don't necessarily feel comfortable with, because you're introducing the sense of almost shaming for lack of activity that comes through. There are a lot of different dynamics here, and any kind of health is a lot more than just that question about your pure physical fitness. There's the mental component to it. I think I can see where the arguments come from that say that we should be looking at that, but I think it needs to be something that's encouraging people to come to ask questions rather than forcing them to do something. It needs to be pull rather than push from the employee's point of view. With all of these sorts of things, right? You have this idea of anonymity, and if you're in a large faceless organization, perhaps that works. But the reality is, we were a 70-person company when we did the Fitbit trial. We offered people guarantee of anonymity. We couldn't help ourselves but work out who was who when the data came through. And to be honest, it wasn't that difficult. And that was just looking at it as humans. If you start running algorithms across it, of course you can tie that back to individuals. So I don't entirely buy the anonymity argument around a lot of this data, because it's quite easy, I think, to be able to tie it back with a reasonable degree of confidence to individuals and make decisions based on that.
I think going back to the point earlier about sort of the push and pull argument, I think if you have employees on board and they understand what the dominant purpose of obtaining that information is, it's definitely going to be easier to allay those concerns. And likewise, as I said earlier, about ensuring that all levels of the organisation are a part of it. I think from an employee perspective, if you're sitting there and someone's telling you that you're going to be tracked because, going back to the call centre example, we need to know that certain metrics are being met. Well, how's the CEO being measured? How's the C-suite being measured? Because if they're not subject to the same conditions, how does that build trust? You can't have a surveillance program and a safe culture if you don't have an underlying or underpinning of trust. And I think people will be more likely to be on board if they understand why it's being done, that everyone's being subject to it, and be transparent. If there's data that's being collected that can be shared, share that information. If it's something that can be made anonymous to a certain extent, or giving people a number so that there's less of a risk that people could be identified, do that. But be open and honest about it, because it's about gaining that trust from your employees to make sure that they understand why they're being measured. If there's overall statistics that can be generated around business metrics and business goals from that surveillance, then to me that helps create a better strategy and a better picture for everyone in the organisation to understand where the business is going.
I'd pick up on is you use the term getting employees on board with it. I think there's a question of level in there, right? Are you prepared to accept it versus are you enthusiastically in favor of it? If you tell people what's going on, they're much more likely to accept that the surveillance is going to take place. Yeah, fine, I can see why it needs to happen. I will allow it to take place. That's not, in my mind, that's not being on board. That's being prepared to tolerate. And I think if it's at a point where it's prepared to tolerate, that means you don't have a psychologically safe culture. And it comes back to my earlier point, which is that I don't believe that employee tracking in the majority of cases is consistent with a psychologically safe culture. I think they're antithetical.